it's good to see you.
Great to see you as well.
Let's talk about Krakatoa.
Yeah.
This is a piece that began because the Barlow Foundation commissioned it on behalf of both the Bandung Philharmonic, which is in Indonesia, and the Baroque on Beaver Music Festival, which is in Beaver Island, Michigan.
Right.
And the reason I ended up choosing Krakatoa as a topic is because Michael Hall is the violist who premiered it in both locations with conductor Robert Nordling. And once we got the commission from Barlow, Michael Hall said to me, I have one word for you, volcanoes. And I did some research, and yes, there are volcanoes throughout the whole Indonesian region. But there was one particular volcano that went off in the 1880s. It's called Krakatoa. And this particular eruption was so severe. There were 4 eruptions on a single day. The last one blew the top off of the volcano.
Yeah.
But it sent a sound wave around the planet about 7 times. Ash went up in the air about 50 miles, which actually changed the way that we saw the atmosphere for a good long while after that. In fact, Edward Monk's painting of the screen
Right.
is of the ash.
It's a beautiful painting, yes.
It is a beautiful painting, but maybe the person's screaming because it's like, what is wrong with the sky?
Exactly.
And it was actually Krakatoa. But Krakatoa also sent up a huge tsunami wave that just barreled right down the Sunda Strait.
Right.
So there was a lot of chaos, a lot of death involved too.
Yeah, it's very interesting. What drew you to make an arrangement for the saxophone from the original viola arrangement?
Yeah, the viola arrangement it's for viola and string orchestra and percussion instruments. And the viola instrument worked really well with that combination. Actually, when we applied for the commission, we did not apply for woodwinds or brass as part of the commission, which is why it's just for strings and orchestra. I'm sorry, for strings and percussion.
Sure.
But I kept thinking during the pandemic that the range of the viola is really similar to the range of the saxophone. How would this sound if it was on saxophone? So there were a number of things that did have to get changed.
Oh, yes.
But I really think this version brings to life all these different colors that exist on the saxophone that don't on the viola. Then again, the viola can do double stops and multiple stops that the saxophone can't. So I think each version has something very unique about it, and that gives us 2 different versions that are equally usable and playable in the orchestral world.
I find that so interesting, and it was wonderful when you approached me about the saxophone version and about collaborating on the process of rearranging it for the instrument. I guess that's what you would say.
Yes.
And I found the same. I found some of the same thoughts as you just expressed about the colors of the instrument and the dynamic range of the instrument of the saxophone. That how it could really well depict the cataclysmic event that happened, surrounding Krakatoa.
Right.
And particularly some of the challenges I think that I found in at least working on the piece were the double stops. How to really effectively bring out those double stops
Without being double stops.
Yes, yes, exactly. And how do we roll the chords with various types of accentuations or bringing out certain pitches of that double stop, with air, with vibrato, with attack. But I think it really worked really quite well.
Yes, and really none of the double stops or multiple stops exist anymore. What we did is change them into a lot of grace notes. So there were a lot of quadruple stops and glissandi in the viola part, especially in the cadenzas. And I know I converted all those over to grace notes and to some portamenti and slides. How did that work with technique for you?
Well, very interesting. The portamenti are always challenges for the saxophone and for the player, depending on the pitches involved and where you are in the range of the instrument. I think some of the portamenti were rather straightforward and rather easy. Others, I had to really adjust some fingering and some voicing techniques. And for me, that's one of the challenges of, anytime you play a new piece, and one of the great challenges, and one of the aspects of performing new music that I truly love, is it really challenges the performer, and I'm a student of the instrument always, and it's always important for us to grow through these things.
And it's a good learning experience for us both, because I'm learning just as much from you about how to shape this, what existed for one instrument, how can we make it as idiomatic as possible for the saxophone so it does not sound like it began as a
Right.
viola piece.
Right, and that's really important. Through our collaborations, I thought you did just a tremendous job of making sure it was very idiomatic for the saxophone. Saxophonists we're always careful when we do transcriptions or when we borrow some other instrument's music, that we're being very true to the original intent of the music that the composer has thought of, that we also are still bringing out our natural voice and without it sounding forced or compromised in any way.
There were some differences between the versions in that the saxophone's lower range has so much more power than the viola. So I feel like the saxophone concerto version will work really well in a larger space where maybe the viola could get buried by the acoustics of the space and the amount of people
Right.
on stage. That said, the saxophone couldn't go as high as the viola.
Right.
And I remember we were both working on the end of the piece. There's a beautiful harmonic section where I'm representing the atmospheric colors that Edvard Munch put into his painting.
Sure.
And for you, how was it working on a technique to get this light floaty sound?
Well, to try to match the harmonics that the viola did, what the version was, it was a little more, it just wasn't going to work for the saxophone. The saxophone would sound like squealing birds up top there.
So we took that down.
And so we had to take that down the octave, but then trying to get up more of a wispy, kind of a diffuse type of a sound,
Yeah.
covered, a veiled sound. And again, that comes with air support, the way you blow into the instrument, and some of the voicing techniques that we used. But that's one of my favorite parts of the piece, because it really presented the challenge of getting that smooth, technical kind of float or wispy
Yes.
sound. And that for me is probably, if not my favorite part of the piece, one of my favorite parts of the piece. I have a lot of favorite parts of the piece, and I truly identified with this piece right from the start. I was so honored that you brought it to me, and I couldn't wait to get started, because I just could really feel the pictorial quality of the story and the narrative, and felt that I could really add to that from a musical perspective, playing the saxophone.
Well, it's been such a pleasure working with you on it. There's 3 movements. The first is imminent, when we don't know when the volcano is about to erupt, and you do a
Right.
fantastic job of channeling the aggression of hearing that this eruption's coming, but we don't know when. And then the second part is eruption, where now you're just letting loose, and the volcano is exploding.
Yeah.
And the power that you unleash is incredible.
Thank you.
And then the third section is dormant. And that's the part where we know that Krakatoa has sunk under the water and is laying dormant. And you do a good job of calming everything down.
Yeah.
But then we hear that we know that Anak Krakatau, which is the child of Krakatoa,
Right.
is actually rising under the surface. And that's where we get that large climax at the end of that third movement before we go into the atmospheric colors.
I mean, it's so brilliantly depicted, the story, and how you've orchestrated it through the orchestra. Do you feel that woodwinds and brass could have added to that orchestration if you used that? I was always curious about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, originally, when we applied for the Barlow grant, we decided that we'd leave the winds and brass out. Then again, I didn't know I was going to be writing about
Right.
a volcanic eruption. But honestly, I think there's a certain visceralness and primitiveness that the piece is allowed to have, because we don't have the woodwinds and brass. So the way I use the string orchestra is really primitive in a sense. Like you get a lot more of these glisses and slides and guttural sounds than you do necessarily of a lot of beautiful music. And the same is true with percussion. In fact, the third movement, I really wanted to give tribute to the Indonesian gamelan, the Javanese gamelan tradition. So depending on which gongs you have, when we were in Indonesia, they were using actual gamelan equipment, if I'm remembering correctly. So that, because of that, I think having woodwinds and brass might have made it feel too westernized.
Right. Maybe from another perspective, the orchestration of just a string orchestra with percussion and the saxophone can kind of stand out a little more and be brought out a little more in the colors that we use to bring out the eruption or to bring out the, and some of the climactic parts of the piece. Really, we're not competing with anybody in the orchestra per se in that same color palette or in that same range. It seems a little heady for me to say that, but it's really true, and it really kind of puts the saxophone in a different light.
Yes.
And I think that's another one of the many reasons why I really love the piece.
Yeah, I've been so thrilled with not only your performance, but the fact that the saxophone is featured so well against the strings and percussion. I think the viola version is equally beautiful, but just very different.
Yeah, it's terrific to have a piece that can have two different types of voices, each with their own special qualities.
Well, Joe, it's been such a pleasure working on transcribing Krakatoa for you from viola over to saxophone. Thank you so much for all the guidance you gave me along the way, and I hope that we get more performances for you throughout concert halls around the country and world.
Well, thank you, and I hope so too, and it's such an honor and pleasure to work with you, to collaborate. It's really what I love to do, is to collaborate with great composers like yourself. And I would love to have that opportunity too, and plan to, of performing Krakatoa throughout the country and the world.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.